what you just said provides a really wonderful arc of actually the early computer days through thinking machines to the future. But you said something right at the beginning that implied that even before you met Danny and started talking about the connection machine or what became the connection machine as a way of realizing these things, that you had maybe even as a child the view of the Library of Alexandria. Can you talk about when your interest in big data and in archiving the world's knowledge started?
Yeah, personally it was, I'm in the very last part of this sort of 60s utopian generation, and a friend of mine, John Hernowitz, asked, okay, with your technology, what can you do that would be better? And it turned out that this was actually a hard question. It was much easier to come up with dystopian worlds or negative things. And so walking across the Charles River back and forth to school, I pondered and tried to figure out what would be a good thing to do with my life with a tech background. And I could only come up with two things. One that was so obvious I didn't want to bother with it, and the other was harder, which was to try to protect people's privacy, even though they'd all want to throw it away. And so I wanted to go off and do that. The other was build the Library of Alexandria that we sort of promised the world. The idea of the Library of Congress on everybody's desk, that kind of thing. This is 1980. And so I went off to try to figure out how to build the chips to make encryption work, even though people didn't want it. And I found that it would be too expensive. And so I fell back on plan B, and Danny, because I've been learning chips in Danny's lab, somebody said, you should talk to Danny. He's got a pretty good idea. That was Tom Knight. He said, Danny's a Renaissance man. He thinks in all sorts of dimensions. And so I met Danny, and he had this way of thinking about building a machine that could be the Library of Alexandria, the way that global brain that we'd sort of been thinking of before. And I said, let's go off and build this thing. I mean, all right, we have to go build some chips and computers, and how hard could it be? And it took a bunch of years later, but we were able to make a machine then. Machines back then were pretty terrible. They could do accounting, they could make airline reservations, and that was thought of as, wow, huge. And it's like, gosh. I mean, they couldn't even store a book, and they couldn't even think about a book. They couldn't. There was all these robots were supposed to be running around, being R2-D2 and C-3PO, and we were just looking at these things like, gosh, they have a hard time not just falling over, just keeping a refrigerator or a washing machine going. So Danny had an idea that we could do something much bigger, and that was the dream that I signed on to try to help build. And Danny was just amazing at foreseeing changes. There are all these noises and all these things that people said, oh, this is the way the future is going to go. He said, nah, it's going to go over here. And I think it's by his taking a big, long view of looking backwards in time and going forwards in time with the technology that was available at the time to be able to build a brain. And so we set out to build a brain. And I wanted the brain so that we could go and fill it with knowledge, that we could teach the machines to be good machines. Because if we're going to bring up our new overlords, let's have them read good books. I mean, kind of as Aristotle taught Alexander, let's do something reasonable.
Well, let's take that a little bit further then, because right now it seems for the last 5 years or so, all of a sudden a lot of things have become possible in AI that were really more pipe dreams than 30 years ago. And this brings back the old Frankenstein fear in people, at least in the Western world. There's this whole another discourse about, well, different religions have different ideas about whether it's okay for human beings to create life or not, and specifically the Christian religion has really the Frankenstein story as the most prominent example and sort of the driving myth behind it. If you create life, it will become something more powerful than you, and it will destroy you. And that's the fear that is being reawakened in a lot of people by talking about AI. And I know that, back in the 80s in Thinking Machines, we were talking about we're going to make a machine that's going to be proud of us. This was one of Danny's sort of
taglines, yes.
Taglines. And we were all very excited by the idea of being able to create machine intelligence that's maybe bigger and better than us. But what is your take on this fear that artificial intelligence will essentially make humans useless or slaves or just sort of so unimportant that the world will be run by machines and the human race will essentially be brushed to the side?
At least in the short and medium term, we were wrong. The idea that these machines were going to sort of take over in the sort of sci-fi sense of Borg machines, Skynet, Terminator, we were wrong. They're much more integrated in with us. I think of Google as sort of our current example of some of the higher form of what we were striving for, where the Google search engine is almost fun to converse with. It knows a lot. And by talking with us, it gets better and smarter. But it's only by talking with us. So there's a symbiotic relationship between our machines and people and the internet. And that's in quite contrast to sort of those heady sort of, it's going to just separate off and not have any need for us and come back and slaughter us sci-fi thing of the 80s, 90s, and even more recently. But I think that this cyberspace of this blur between people and machines, you see people now glued to their phones in ways that it is them. Their memories, and it is part of their brain, not only the local storage, but the network and the connection with other people, that we're becoming much more interconnected through these machines because the machines are augmenting our relationship structures. It's hard to remember. Answering machines were thought of as a big boon at that time, right? So 1980 was, wow, there were answering machines, and that was sort of machines that were starting to help us.
But it wasn't everyone who was excited by them. I had a vast number of friends who, when they got the answering machine, the next time they saw me in person, would just yell at me and say, if I call you, it's because I want to talk to you, not a machine, and how come you're using this technology, you're cutting yourself off from me, etc. So not everyone sees these levels as being positive, and there's a lot of concern that people are getting so stuck on their smartphones that, well, beyond the fact that they're not watching where they're going and they're committing sort of suicide by cell phone, they are also not talking with human beings anymore. So how do you feel about that? I mean, Danny talks about what he's calling now the entanglement as sort of the next stage after the enlightenment. The entanglement being where, as you're talking about, machines and software and humans are entering into a new symbiosis. But there is a tremendous concern that our, shall we say, core humanity will then be diverted into ways that fit better with the machines, and things that don't fit with machines will be forgotten or just underdeveloped, especially in children growing up with them, with these machines.
Yes, we're becoming entangled, symbiotic, and the like. But there are evidences of life forms other than people. And I would think I love this photo. It's got a good group of people.